The United Nations is appealing for $2 billion to support humanitarian efforts worldwide to fight the pandemic. In an exclusive interview with our diplomatic editor, James Bays, Secretary General Antonio Guterres says it's in everyone's interest to help the world's poorest nations, especially in areas of conflict.
Well, this is exactly an appeal for that. It is a humanitarian appeal for those countries in conflict, for those fragile states, for refugee camps, internal displacement camps, that have dramatic humanitarian needs that need to go on being met, but on top of that have now the threat of COVID-19. And we need to do everything to prevent the disease to come to those areas to the extent possible. And at the same time, in those areas you have people sometimes in slums of big cities or in camps in which it's very difficult to have isolation. There is no water in the households, sometimes no soap. Healthcare facilities are extremely rudimentary. So we need to boost the response capacity in those areas. That's why we have asked and we mobilized all UN agencies, the Red Cross, Red Crescent Movement, a large number of NGOs. We mobilized all to work together and with those funds, with those $2 billion, to make sure that we are able to have a strong push for prevention in those vulnerable areas, and at the same time to bring the equipment that is required, ventilators, tests, suits for the staff to allow for contact with people impacted.
You've called for a global ceasefire in conflict zones, but let me give you a couple of examples. In recent weeks, things have been going in the opposite direction in some of those conflicts. Let me ask you how worried you are about the increase in hostilities in Yemen.
Well, I am, even if one of the most important movements in Yemen has declared that they would accept the ceasefire or that the appeal of ceasefire. We have other armed movements in other parts of the world saying that they would be ready to abide by it. All our special representatives and envoys everywhere in the world are pushing to make sure that this appeal is translated in diplomatic action, bringing together the parties to the conflict for the ceasefire to become a reality. We have had initiatives in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, in many other parts of the world. And I hope that this appeal will be heard and that people will understand that there is only one war that is necessary today. It's a war against the virus.
You mentioned Libya there. There was already supposed to be a humanitarian pause in Libya, but one side has not been respecting it. General Haftar in recent weeks seems to have intensified his campaign. What's your message to him?
It's necessary to stop. And I believe that in the last few days there was a clear decrease in hostilities, even if even the day before yesterday there was a very meaningful attack. But this is the moment to stop all military action. This is the moment to concentrate on fighting COVID-19.
We're already seeing COVID-19 cases in Gaza. You've been there, you know, it's one of the most crowded places on earth. How are you supposed to self-isolate if you're someone living in a place like Gaza?
Well, it is extremely difficult, but the same applies to the slums of big cities in different parts of the developing world, to refugee camps. It is much more difficult, and that is the reason why we massively need support for those areas, and we massively need to increase the capacity to respond, and the health services that are so weak in those areas need to be very quickly boosted.